Hi, I wanted to make a short video about carbon offsets, and as you can see from the title, there's still a little bit of controversy about whether this is an effective way to address global warming or if it's just a tool for rich people to assuage their guilt. Carbon offset is buying someone else's reduction of carbon emissions and applying it to our own carbon footprint. So PepsiCo can buy carbon offsets and claim that it's a carbon neutral company, while they still actually have emissions in their fleet of trucks, of employee flights, and so on. Now, I say reduction here in yellow, but it can be a lot of other things. An offset could be avoidance of carbon, the destruction of industrial pollutants with high global warming potential, and then sequestering is obviously the storage of carbon dioxide. In the U.S., the offset market is completely voluntary. You can choose to buy a pass from TerraPass for your driving for a year, or some airlines, American and Delta, I think, offer offsets for flights. In Europe, the offsets are part of the mandatory Kyoto Protocol agreement that Europe signed, are part of the Clean Development Mechanism and joint implementation. These are the flexibility mechanisms of Kyoto available to European countries with a binding cap. Offsets can be generated in a number of ways. Flaring or capturing landfill or mine methane gas is a real good one. An example of turning a more powerful chemical or compound with high global warming potential into something that's more benign. Reforestation is probably the dominant source of offsets in the United States. So this is either planting new forests or going back to forests that have been harvested or clear-cut and replanting those. There's some issues with any sort of forest-based offset, and we'll talk about those when we talk about permanence. We've already talked about destruction of industrial pollutants with high global warming potential. Replacing incandescent with compact fluorescent light bulbs. These are energy efficiency projects, and some of those have offset possibilities. And no-till farming is one way that soil carbon can be sequestered. And wind energy projects or renewable energy projects, these could be solar. These will often be carbon avoidance projects. I should mention that the costs, and this is per ton of CO2 equivalent, the price ranges from just under $2 to over $40, and so a huge price range depending on timing, the quality of the offset, where it's sold, who needs it, and so on. Offset characteristics are important to understand. They can be for immediate purchase, they can be for future use, they can be for existing projects or for projects to be created after the offset funds are collected, and then that provides the investment for the particular project. Ownership, you have to be a little careful because there were claims that offsets were being sold twice, and without very much verification or auditing, this could happen. Verification then is real important in terms of buying quality offsets. You want third-party verification that in fact there was a reduction or there will be an avoidance of carbon emissions, and that these won't be sold twice, that you'll have sole ownership to them, and so on. And groups are putting together verification policies that do this. If you go to Native Energy, they have a long description of how they measure reductions and avoidance, and it looks pretty thorough. Reduction or avoidance, reduction is pretty obvious. It's something that actually reduces existing CO2 emissions to some lower level. So switching to a different fuel, capturing methane and flaring it off, as I said, that sort of stuff. Avoidance is a little more confusing. If you build a wind turbine and that wind turbine then either delays or eliminates the need for a coal-fired power plant, you've avoided the CO2 emissions that would be associated with that coal-fired plant. And so here's avoidance of some future emissions. Very hard to calculate because of the timing and whatnot. The Native Energy site has a metric for computing avoidance, and basically what they do is they estimate what the future reduction might be, and then they discount that for time probability that it will or won't happen. And so let me talk about additionality, and this is probably the biggest snag in offset projects. The question that you have to ask is, would the project be done without the sale of the offsets? And if the answer is yes, then the offsets really aren't additional in the sense of reducing carbon emissions. If it was going to be done anyway, you don't buy the offset, it's still going to be done. Those reductions would have occurred with or without your investment. So you should find a place to invest where you get additionality. Why would a project be being done anyway with or without offsets? Well, it could be something that's financially profitable to do, and so a company doesn't need the offset income. It could be something that's required by law. It could just be business as usual. Soil carbon is a good example of this, where farmers who were using no-till techniques would be approached by carbon offset dealers who would say, oh, I can make you some extra money, just keep doing what you're doing, we'll send you some money. So they don't change their behavior. There's no change then in carbon emissions or sequestration. There's just an income stream that suddenly comes to these people. Permanence is this notion that if you reduce carbon emissions by a ton, that later on those reduced emissions won't appear again. And this happens most often in forestry projects. You plant a tree, it sequesters carbon, the tree dies, it releases the carbon. So if you invest in offsets based on forestry, you need some assurance that there's going to be a replanting of trees near the end of lifespan of existing trees, or if there's a fire or disease that they'll be replanting. Otherwise, what you've done is you've temporarily reduced carbon, but then it's come back. So permanence is a big deal, and in forestry projects it can reverse itself. So what are the benefits of carbon offsets? I think the biggest one is that when we purchase offsets, that provides financial support for these carbon reducing, avoiding, destroying activities. And when a pool of money is put together, combined with funds by investors, that may be enough to make a project viable. They can reduce carbon emissions right away. I mean, if you get the right project, we're going to get carbon reductions, and that's super. They are a way to find the lowest cost way to reduce carbon. They're easy. You click a button, give a credit card number, that kind of thing. It's real simple. And the other thing that I think is nice about them is the units that they can be purchased in: a plane ride, a year of driving, for your attendance at a conference, and so on. So they can be tailored to the activity that you're interested in and make that activity carbon neutral from your perspective anyway. So those are all huge benefits, the financial support one probably being the most important. What are the weaknesses? The first one, and I've alluded to this before, is there's a verification issue here. You give money to somebody, but you don't really get to see, or it's difficult to see, what that money's buying. And even if you go to a place like the Carbon Catalog and you say, well, I want to invest in this methane capture project in Honduras, you don't really know how the carbon reduction has been measured, or if it's happening. You don't know if this particular project offset has been sold more than once, and so on. So verification is really hard, and we have third-party groups that are starting to practice verification, and they're associated with offset dealers. And I think it's good when buying an offset to make sure that there is that third-party verification. There can be a rebound effect. If you buy a year's worth of carbon emission offsets for driving, say from TerraPass, then your inclination may be not to cut back on your driving. You've paid for your carbon reduction, so you're going to drive and do what's convenient. Now, if you didn't have the offset and you were concerned about global warming, you might cut back on your driving, pure carbon reduction. The other part about carbon offsets is they aren't a huge part of the solution here. I have some data from 2007. It said that total offset sales were about 65 million tons CO2 equivalents. This is compared to 40 billion tons of carbon emissions that year. So the offsets amounted to less than 1/4% of the total emissions. So it's a teeny portion. So if you think about having an impact, offsets certainly help. Every little bit helps, but it's not a huge impact in terms of this market yet. Now, the last two, and I'll talk about the second one rather, is this indulgence idea. Like religious indulgences for a certain amount of money, you get forgiven for sins, and this cartoon really captures it well. Forgive me, for I've SUV'd. More important, I think, is the next to last one, and this has to do with incentives to make real reductions. If we buy offsets and we think, gosh, we're doing our bit for carbon reduction, we continue to emit lots of carbon dioxide. The offsets create reduced incentives to make real reductions. And if, in buying offsets, we go ahead and build buildings and manufacture cars that are still high carbon emitters relative to what technology would allow us to do, then what we've done is we've locked in for 5, 6, 7 years for cars, or 30 or 40 years for buildings, high emissions infrastructure. And if we do that, then our baseline emissions are going to be higher as we go through time. Now, economic models that estimate the cost of reducing carbon emissions are based on some baseline. The higher this baseline, the more costly it is to get back down to 1990 or year 2000 levels of CO2 emissions, because we have more reduction to do. And so offsets could create a situation where we make it harder for meaningful solutions to global warming to be addressed, or for politicians to design meaningful legislation, because the cost is just going to get too high. If that cost increases, it draws more people into that camp of, oh, it's too expensive, we can't do anything about global warming, and we'll just wait for some sort of technological silver bullet. Baseline increases can be an outcome of offsets, and thus offsets are not moving us towards meaningful change and real reductions. So we have to be careful about this. Here are my recommendations. If you're a business and it's important for you to be carbon neutral, then the only way you're going to be able to do it is by reducing emissions as much as you can in-house and then supplementing with offsets. You can't get away with not using offsets. If carbon neutrality isn't such a big deal, then in-house reductions are by far the best way to go, because you can verify them. You know exactly what you're doing, and you can have pretty good estimates of the reductions that you've made. And I say in the third line, a mix of in-house and offsets could be very good if you get verified offsets, and it can be the least costly mix. You make the changes that are relatively inexpensive in-house, and then you go out and buy offsets at whatever price they are that's close to the cost that you're paying. For individuals, personal carbon reductions are by far the best, just like businesses. You want to do it in-house because they're verifiable and they reduce the baseline and so on. I think going the next step, though, you have to ask yourself this. I have a limited budget for doing something environmental or sustainable. Is global warming my big passion? And if so, is my budgeted amount to address global warming best spent on offsets? Or would it be better spent for an environmental group that's fighting climate change, or that will help lobby for climate change legislation? Would it be better used to elect a politician that's pro cap and trade or carbon tax? Now, if global warming isn't your issue, then offsets may not make any sense at all, because although some of them have sustainable development and biodiversity aspects to them, forestry, for example, certainly has habitat protection and biodiversity aspects. But it might be better to go directly to those groups that do exactly what you're interested in. So Nature Conservancy, if you're interested in land issues, poverty alleviation, there's lots and lots of groups that are working on that in microfinance and so on. So I think for individuals anyway, it becomes a budgetary and preference decision about what is it that I care about, and I've got limited dollars. How do I get the most benefit or generate the most impact for those limited number of dollars? Anyway, I hope this gives you an overview of what carbon offsets are about, and we'll try to have another video later.